Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey everyone, I am really excited to welcome back Kathy Oneto to the podcast. Kathy is the founder of Sustainable Ambition, host of the Sustainable Ambition podcast, and now author of the new book, Sustainable Ambition: How to Prioritize What Matters to Thrive in Life and Work, which has come out in June 2025. She is also an executive and life work coach, speaker, and facilitator whose mission is to help ambitious organizations, teams, and individuals explore how to live and work differently for more success, satisfaction, and sustainability. With a portfolio career and drawing from her 25 years of experience, she is also a strategy consultant and advisor who partners with ambitious organizations and leaders who want to do better for their business, customers, and people, helping them illuminate and make progress on what matters. Please join me in welcoming Kathy Oneto. Welcome, Kathy. Welcome back.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks so much for having me back. I'm really thrilled to be here today.
Yeah, I'm so excited, and I'm excited about your book. I know it's been a labor of love and so much more, and you've been working on this for quite some time. It's a lot to craft and to put together a book while you're also working in your own business full time. So take us back to the time when you decided to write the book and how that came about.
It's interesting because this is a common question that people ask me, which is, how long did it take you to write the book? And one can kind of think, well, gosh, when did that process actually start? And I decided to write a book about sustainable ambition, even when the idea of sustainable ambition came to fruition, if you will. So I had been thinking about life and work management, frankly, all of my adult life. And I had been thinking about career transition, certainly prior to the term sustainable ambition coming about. But even when I started my podcast almost 5 years ago, I kind of knew that I had the ambition of writing a book. And so I would say, the idea of writing the book came, for some time ago, but then the actual kind of writing of it was probably about 2.5 years into, from starting the actual process to getting to the book coming into the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Having been through a similar I say a similar process because I think everybody's process is different. But there is that thought of, over time of, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe I'll write a book. I think starting a podcast is a decision, right? And then it's one thing to kind of ponder it, then make the decision, and then actually then immerse yourself in the process, right? It kind of parallels to some degree thinking about making some kind of significant career transition or propel yourself into another type of activity in a way. I just thought about that just now. Like, it's not like you've been writing books your whole life, even though what you wrote about are things you've probably been thinking about for a long time. But the endeavor of writing a book, or then telling people you're writing a book, because then once you tell people you're writing a book, then you kind of feel like, oh, now I got to come up with this book, right?
For sure. For sure. It definitely is a creative act, right?
Yeah.
As you and I were talking about previously. And I think coming back to that connection to career, this is an interesting insight that, based on some research I've even been doing this year, kind of has solidified for me, which is that I think our pursuits of ambitions do tend to follow a traditional kind of creative path, if you will, where you have, if you just simply say there's two sides of any goal or ambition or creative activity, which is
Mm.
a side of exploration and getting to a point of decision of, "Oh, this is what I wanna pursue," and then the second, which is, "Okay, now I've kind of committed to this," and just like you just said, Tammy, which is, "Oh my gosh, I now just told people I'm going to do this, so now I'm locked in," right? And
Yeah.
not everybody stays locked in, and that's
Yeah.
okay, right?
Right.
You can, of course, change your mind because you're gonna learn along the way, and that's really important to adjust to those things. But
Right.
I think it's helpful to think about things in those 2 realms, and I'm way oversimplifying here. There's usually, like,
Yeah.
kind of a traditional creative process has, 4 to 5 stages, what have you, but really there is that exploration time, and then there's post-decision time, and I think seeing it in both those ways can be really
Mm.
valuable because oftentimes we do not give ourselves that space up front for that exploration, which is
Yes.
really, really critical.
Oh, I love what you just said about that because I can relate a lot to what you're saying in terms of that giving ourselves that exploration time. I think that's relates so much to how people often handle their careers, and they don't give themselves enough of that time, and they're but there's also all the practicalities, right, of jumping into it's different than writing a book while you're also working, and, the book becomes it may become a big part of your work and your life, but at the same time, if you're working to make a living, there's a focus there, and I understand why some people in their careers may have to jump off of the exploration wagon and just jump into a decision because they gotta make a paycheck, right? But when it comes to something like writing a book, it usually becomes something that is, I don't wanna say a sideline because I think it's more central than that, but it does become, something that is aligned or, let's say, walking along with what you're doing, right?
For sure. And I mean, this relates to the book and what I talk about in the book too,
Yeah.
because I believe that ambitions are not just for work, that they are for what I just simply say life ambitions as well. And,
Yeah.
one can say then like personal ambitions. So whether or not this book or anyone's book is considered, connected to one's profession, which a lot of people suggest that, or it's connected to something that just fuels them personally, it's
Mhm.
still a worthy ambition if they deem it worthy of their effort. And
Uh-huh.
so yeah, and I think that what's important is to claim life ambitions and to, if that's a priority for you at this time. And, I do reference in the book some notions around, you know, ways to perhaps sometimes, yes, you do have to put personal ambitions on the back burner and not prioritize certain things. But other times, what are small ways you can nurture an ambition?
Yeah.
No one says that something like a book has to come out within the time frame that a book,
Right.
typically comes out. A lot of people do work on their books for some period of time. I have a good friend who I mention in the book who is a fiction writer and she runs a business, a public affairs business here in San Francisco. She is very successful. She's had life events that take her attention away, business events that take her attention away. And yet she has remained committed to her personal ambition around writing these fiction books. And she fits it in when she can. She paces herself. She allows her goals to shift and change. But it is an ambition that fuels her and gives her added energy for those things she does need to put her attention to at certain
Mhm.
moments in her life. So I do think that nurturing ambitions that are important to us is really helpful and does create more fulfillment and satisfaction in our lives and actually energizes us for everything else we need to do.
Yeah. It's interesting. I You said, it's important to claim life ambitions, and I love the way you said that, and I started to think about how I often will say, many of us were raised to sort of put kind of a dividing line between life and work, as if personal and professional are separate things, and they are in some ways, but in other ways they're really quite blended. It depends on the person, of course. For me personally, they are very blended because I find my work to be personally satisfying. And so I'm curious, in terms of the context of your book and your work, how you do you distinguish those very clearly, or do you speak to the combination of them?
So I think I definitely speak to this, and I think I speak to it in both ways in the sense of, one of the things I write about in the book very clearly is I don't love the term work-life balance, and
Oh,
part
I
of the
hate that
reason
term.
I know. So many of us do, right? And yet
Yeah.
it's so interesting how it's the common lexicon that our culture latches onto, and I don't like it because it sets unrealistic expectations, and I think one of the expectations it tends to set with people is this idea that you are going to have hard boundaries between life and work. And it's just not realistic in terms, especially in our modern world. And I say that, and yet, people who lived on farms and worked in agriculture, it was quite blended, their life and their work. It's all integrated. And
Yeah.
so, for those of us who really want a lot more flexibility, too, to think that you're going to have these hard boundaries, I think is just unrealistic. And it's not to say then that that's easy. It actually, when you don't have hard boundaries, it does make it harder, right? To
Yeah.
protect time, to make sure you're taking breaks. You do need to
Right.
get time away
Yes.
from work. But that's the piece where I say yes, and which is I do think that we are integrated. I really do champion this idea that we've talked about, which is ambitions are not just for work, they are for life too. And I think I say that because in our certainly Western culture, ambition is tied to career and work. And
Yes. Yes.
what I, by simply saying claim life ambitions, I'm trying to tell people like, hey, you can be ambitious about other things. You can be ambitious about developing, a creative, capability. You can be ambitious about, I even joke and say, like, about being a great sleeper or taking naps or being a great meditator. Not that we're supposed to be great at meditating, but, you can have these other ambitions that are really important to you. You can be ambitious about wanting to be a wonderful parent or a wonderful partner, a wonderful friend. And I think when people start to have a sense of that permission, it unlock something for them, as well
Yeah.
as, there are added benefits to just broadening our sense of who we are and what our identity really is, which is beyond just how we define ourselves in terms of our work. So I do think claiming these and thinking about them as separate can be really, really helpful for people.
Yeah, yeah. I think just in terms of having a sense of, especially when you're trying to build on something, right? And I love the phrase sustainable ambition, because when you just spoke to that just now, like you could be a better sleeper. That I could relate to that one. But it does there's something very satisfying, and it carries over, in that sustainable way to other things as well that might impact your life in general. And your work often has more clarity or definition around it, whereas certain things could be more pervasive across your life. So there's having some boundaries actually, I think, gives you the structure you need to have that focus and to be ambitious about something. But I love this whole idea of life ambitions. And yet, you know, you could be ambitious about trying to develop a creative side that could turn into something that becomes a vocation, perhaps, or not. It doesn't really matter one way or the other, right? But I love the way that you're framing this, because I think it gives us permission to be whole human beings, really.
Exactly.
So take us through the book a little bit more in terms of how you move the reader through the book and how they can use the book to really engage themselves in more sustainable ambition.
What a great question. Well, where I start with people is really helping people rethink and reclaim what success and ambition really is. And so that is one of the core, elements of the book. in terms of helping us understand that success doesn't have to be defined. It's just a construct, right? So it doesn't have to be defined just by how we do in modern society. If you go back to philosophical texts, which I don't go into in the book, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of different ways that philosophers define success, and
Mhm.
modern philosophers do the same. Some of those
Yeah.
are in the book, but it's like, so success doesn't have to be what society deems it to be, and nor does ambition have to be defined in the way that we've been told to define it. And so I start there because I think in helping us redefine and reclaim what those terms are for ourselves, we can step into this work and actually truly claim sustainable ambition as our own. And a core construct around the book in this notion of sustainability is that sustainable ambitions aren't really, or ambitions aren't sustainable unless they are yours. And so
Mhm.
there's this element of personal ownership stepping into your, from an adult development standpoint, what's called your self-authored mind as
Mhm.
opposed to the socialized mind, and starting to really claim like what really matters to me, what is meaningful and motivating to me. And so I invite people into, in the way that the book is structured, this idea to become more consciously ambitious, and that sustainability lives at the intersection of the right ambitions at the right time with the right effort. And when I use the term right, it's not to mean there is a right or wrong. What right means is what is right for you.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so the book is then structured to take folks through what are right ambitions? How do you define them for yourself? What is right time? How do you think about what matters to you now? How do you put focus? How do you make choices when you want to do so much? And then, right effort. How do you manage your effort? And both two sides there, which is how do you be discerning about where you put your hard work? And then the second is how do you sustain yourself while you're in pursuit of these ambitions? And then I close the book with both, how do you bring it all together, and then just some wrap up. But, the book is written in a way to, yes, there's stories in there to bring real people into this narrative,
Mhm.
and it is practical. I'm a strategist at heart, and so there are tools and exercises in there, partly because I really personally don't always like when I read books and it's kind of like, okay, those are great concepts. I have no idea how to actually apply this in my life now. Now, sometimes having just ideas are really quite helpful. Some people will say to me, wow, sustainable ambition. I love that. And great. If people just get the title and they get benefit from it, if people read even just chapter one, because I give a lot in chapter one to like have people understand the framework and the method up front, beautiful, go
Yeah.
go forward and leverage what works for you. But I also do offer some practical tools and tips all throughout to help people who are really, I think, in the midst of a change or needing to make some choices at an inflection point, and really can benefit from the exercise in the book, by going a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would really appreciate the tools and the exercises to really bring some of these things to life for themselves. Obviously, in the kind of work that I do, I and the work you do, of course, we come across a lot of people who are looking for that clarity and definition and looking for that alignment in their lives. So I could easily see where people would benefit a great deal from that. I'm excited to, get my copy of the book. Now it comes out in June. Is there a specific date that the book will be available?
Yes, it's available June 10th.
June 10th. All right. Mark your calendars, everyone. I'm so excited about this. I have every confidence. I know it's gonna be a wonderful, wonderful book. So you said, you'd been thinking about this for a few years or more, a little more, and then you spent about 2.5 years really writing and putting it together. What was that process like for you? Was it intense, or how did you pace yourself through that process?
I love that you said pacing, because that's definitely a strategy in the book, and I also leveraged pacing to help me, write the book and do it in a way that would be sustainable. So, I started out we both know AJ Harper and her top
Yeah.
3 book workshops, and I was lucky enough to get introduced to AJ's work and, jumped into I had tried to work on the book, so it was probably even longer that I'd been working on it because I tried to do work on my own, and I just wasn't making the kind of progress that I had wanted, so
Yeah.
I was grateful to join AJ's workshop and, make significant progress in, like, 2.5 months or 3 months, and it just felt so good, and and then it really is an interesting process. I don't think people recognize or realize when a book is on the shelf, all the steps that go into it. It's, Tammy, like it is a lot. And so, while I had the concepts and construct, it's interesting whenever you do something that's a creative process. I've gone through various training and you have as well. For example, our speaker training that we did, which
Right.
they say to you, trust the process. And I will say that it's really important to trust the process and not think that you're going to get it right out of the gate.
Right.
Everyone talks about that. I'm going to use the term crappy first draft, and it's so important
Yeah.
because you really do just need to get something out in order to then work with it and see how it takes shape over time. And so that was certainly a key part of the process, but I also tested everything that's in the workbook or in the
Mhm.
book rather. So I did workshops with people to test the concepts, test the tools, hone them, sharpen them, simplify them down
Mhm.
to make them something that was more accessible
Mhm.
for the book. And so that was a component of the process. And so it wasn't just all writing.
Right.
And, you certainly I had that. I had doing additional research. And then you actually get into the writing process. And as you know,
Mhm.
there's different multiple stages
Yes.
of the editing process. And I actually worked with my publisher too. They originally gave me a schedule and I said, you need to give me more time here. There's like this is not going to be sufficient time for me,
Mhm.
knowing myself in terms of how I write and what amount of time I needed for editing and for feedback. And so why is this book coming out in June? Perhaps it's not the best time to come out. I mean, it's an evergreen topic, but it's like, this is what worked, and this is the pacing that worked best for me in
Mhm.
terms of making sure that I allowed myself the time and the space to fit it into my life.
Yeah. I love the way you just explained the process because and I'm sure it's different for different people, but I do think that the way you just shared it is really helpful because that could apply to a number of different, sizable projects that any of us might take on. It's never quite what it appears, although I was just thinking of when if we're watching a movie, right? And there's a writer in the movie and we see them over a typewriter or those of us who remember typewriters, and we think all they're doing is sitting and writing. And you're right, there's so many other pieces of the process, and which makes it kind of fun, actually. I remember trying to figure out the book cover part, which, it could be stressful. I thought it was fun, actually. I think there's so many different elements that can really, you can think of it as fun or you can think of it as stressful. It's all how you hold it. I love the fact that you said to your publisher, I need more time. And you were able to make that happen. I also would say that I think the book coming out in June is actually a perfect time because this is a time of year where people do tend to ease up and slow down a little bit and do some reflection. And I would say this is a great time for people to get their hands on a book like yours and go through some of the exercises and decide, what kinds of things they might want to be working on and what kinds of things they wanna claim or reclaim for themselves. So, to me, mid-June is ideal, actually. So, I don't know what anyone else told you, I don't really care, but
No, I think you're right. It is a great mid-year point for people to pause and reflect. You also just sparked an idea, Tammy, which is I think it's a great moment in time too for people to think about, so one of the exercises I have in the book is creating your sustaining plan. And what would be interesting is for people to think about what is a behavior you start to adopt in the summer that is
Yeah.
connected with slowing down or doing things you really love and enjoy, and how do you claim that and not let go of it as
Mhm.
you step into the fall months and start to move towards the holidays. Could be a really fun and interesting exercise and way to think about it, such that you carry that sense of spaciousness, or slowing down, or subtraction is one of the concepts. I It's not in the book, but I love this idea of allowing ourselves to subtract things from our list. How do you kind of carry those things forward?
Yeah. And what also just came to mind with the idea of, really trying to claim and reclaim and slow down, really, creating something sustainable. It does, I think, require you to slow down enough to really not just to come up with a plan, but to really deepen and get in your bones. Why am I doing this? I always use the example of somebody who's going to a bank to get a mortgage to buy a house, right? And you say, so why do you need this mortgage? Well, I'm going to buy a house. Well, great. That's great. But why? Why do you need to buy a house? Well, it's more than just putting a roof over your head. There are a lot of people who might say, well, I really want to create a home, a real home for my family. Like that is at the heart. That's more of the why. It's not just, well, I need a house. Well, yeah, but you don't need a house. You could get a condo, you could rent an apartment. There's lots of ways to put a roof over your head, you know, but what is it about buying a house that is important to you? And I think when you think about really slowing down, it's not just slowing down means the opposite of being always in a rush. Like, what's the why behind that? And when I think we could, not just slow down in the summer, but what would it be like if we just didn't rush through everything all the time?
Totally, Tammy. This has been so present for me of late. And I'll just be transparent and saying, like, as you know, during a book launch period and getting ready for it, like, it
Yeah.
is a full time. And I have had to, as I talk about in the book too, like, I've had to make my world small. I'm pretty focused on
Yeah.
where I'm putting my time and attention right now. And yet, I know I need space. I've needed space since the beginning of the year to
Yeah.
step back, reflect, do exactly kind of the exercise that you're saying, which is, okay, what's important for me now? At this stage, at the end of this ambition, at the
Um,
end of this period and arc, where do I go from here? And
right.
the ideas will not come to you if every single moment of your life is full and
Mm.
you're operating at a fast pace. You really do need to slow down and create some space, even if it's for an hour, even if it's for half a day. I think, getting half a day or at least a day, I think can be so beneficial. And unless you create that spaciousness to kind
Yeah.
of check in, so many people operate on autopilot. And,
Yeah.
that is part of what I'm inviting people into, which is stop operating on autopilot or on the
Yeah.
shoulds, and to really kind of ask yourself, what do you want? What is important to you? And I know I was just having this conversation with somebody where they're like, I'm kind of scared to ask those questions. People do get kind of scared to ask these questions, but I think it's really important to tune in to kind of
Mhm.
understand. And I wanted to go back because I think we were going to go back so far in the conversation, but
Yeah.
we were talking about, work versus life ambitions. And I
Yeah.
think, sometimes you had said, like, sometimes we do just need to take a job in kind of quotes, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
yet, my hope for people is in that is to still tap into what motivates you about that and why
Yes.
it's important, right? And
Yeah.
so, just as you're saying, to do those questioning of exactly what you were just saying around the mortgage, because personally, I don't want anyone going off to their job feeling like it's drudgery. And my
Right.
hope is you can connect it to something that is important and that matters to you, even
Right.
if it's, I can take care of myself and that's important for me, or create some level of
Right.
stability and I really value stability. Like, why is
Exactly.
it important to you?
Right. And I think you do have to, pace yourself as we use the word pace. I think that's an important word. And take a step or a half a step back and say, okay, maybe I'm taking a job that isn't my, dream job or ideal job. However, there are these other things that really matter to me that I need to take care of and not focus on what this isn't, but focus on what it is. And I think that's absolutely really important, but I think too often we end up on the negative, the glass is half empty type thing. And we have to remind ourselves, well, how are we going to remind ourselves of those things? Usually when we slow down a little bit and remind ourselves or have a conversation with somebody who we trust and have them remind us, remember, there's a reason why you're doing this thing you're doing right now. So these are all important pieces, I think, to what you're also conveying through the book. And it's getting me thinking already. I'm going to be pining away now for June 10th, I think. Um, it's just I'm very excited about this. I think we all, to one degree or another, even if you're the kind of person, I've spoken to a few people lately who've said this, I love to be busy. I love to be busy. It's like there's nothing wrong with being busy. I think that the key is, are you busy just for the sake of being busy, or is it that you have a lot of energy and you like to stay active? I spoke to somebody just yesterday who told me that in a career that stretches over 28 years so far, he'd only taken one full week off in between some of his jobs. And he had been switching jobs every 4 years or so. And so, that says to me, yeah, it's time to do a little bit more easing up and reflecting, not because you have to super analyze yourself, but just to get a little perspective, even. You know, if you're afraid what you're going to find out if you ask yourself those questions, don't ask the questions right away. Just take a moment and just let yourself sit for a moment and see what comes up in your mind. It'll show up one way or another. Don't you
For
think?
sure. I do. And the reason why I think it is important is that it's not uncommon for people to at some point kind of hit a road bump and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what have I been doing?" Right?
Yeah.
And so if you don't pause to reflect, there are a couple quotes in the book that I really love. Like one is from Henry David Thoreau where he says, "It is not enough to be industrious. What are you industrious about?"
Love it.
Right? There's an intentionality there. And then there's a quote that I have from Juliette Binoche, the actress, who talks about this sense of being busy. And, an interviewer says to her, "You're so busy." She says, I'm not so much busy. I'm being creative, essentially. And, then there's another quote that I have where I reference Oliver Berkman. And I think, ultimately what he's saying in what I reference is this idea of like, what can happen for some of us is that we're just filling up empty space.
Mm.
Right. And even Juliette Binoche says something to that effect. It's kind of like, sometimes when you're busy, we're just, trying to fill something up, but we're not really being intentional. And
Yeah.
that is really what I'm inviting people into here, which is just to be a little bit more consciously ambitious,
Yeah.
even in this idea of claiming life ambitions, because the reality is most of us have them. We
Yeah.
just aren't conscious about it. And if
Right.
we get a little bit more intentional, I do think we can find a feeling of more personal success and satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the, you hear about, well, one day I'll get around to it, you know. And somebody once gave me actually a piece of paper, a round piece of paper, and wrote on it, round to it, TUIT. So, I am just excited about this book coming out, Kathy. Is there anything else that you want people to know about your work or about the book that they should be looking forward to at this point?
I'm gonna say more of just a lesson perhaps to kind of take
Yeah.
away from the book, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
Just that, sustainable ambition in and of itself is aspirational
Ah,
and ambitious. And in the sense that it is not a one and done kind of thing, it really is a practice. And that we are human and our natural human tendencies is part of what makes finding work life balance, if you will, even though neither of us like that term. I would say finding life work sustainability and finding sustainable ambition. It's not an easy thing because we're human. And
yeah,
so to just also in this journey, give yourself some, I say to be generous with yourself and give yourself some grace.
I
And
love
just
it.
know you're going to get it wrong at times, and that's okay. And then you just get back into practice.
Yeah, I love that you said practice because I think it is something that you just keep doing because it'll evolve over time as your life changes too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I love that. It's not a one and done kind of thing. It's aspirational. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your work and your book with us. June 10th, it comes out, and I'm going to tell everyone far and wide to get their hands on it because I think it's really an important book for work and life. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Tammy. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of my interview with Kathy Oneto. What is your takeaway from our conversation? If you are interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's podcast, you can find them in the show notes on my website at tammygoolerloeb.com/podcast. Just look for episode 278. And while you're there, you can also subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes. Did you know that ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts can help this podcast reach more people? Please help me to inspire more people to move their careers in meaningful directions by clicking on the Apple Podcast button and leave an honest rating and brief review. Those things help the visibility of the podcast and will help more people. Are you anticipating your next professional move? Check out my award-winning book, Work from the Inside Out: Break Through 9 Common Obstacles and Design a Career That Fulfills You. It's available through my website, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores, or through your local library. You can also help sustain the podcast by buying me a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TammyGL. Since this podcast is self-funded, your support is acknowledged and appreciated. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's never too late or too impossible to increase your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. Let me know how it's going for you. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.